Hey folks, this is Kelani. Balance tuning and changes are nothing new in World of Warcraft. You can expect at least something to get swapped around or tweaked and tuned pretty much every patch, and patch 8.2.5 is no exception. There's one new nerf that we just learned about that is a little bit sneaky though, and it has some interesting ties to how gear works in battle for Azeroth. So that's what I want to talk about in this video, but first, the nerf. What's going on in patch 8.2.5 that's important enough to bring up the problems with gear yet again? Gems are on the chopping block again, they're going to get nerfed. Alright, calm down, don't panic too much, it's just the one type of gem for now. The 120 stat gems, the Leviathan's Eyes, that were new in patch 8.2, are getting knocked down a notch. Instead of the 120 primary stat that they provide right now, in patch 8.2.5 they will only give you 100 primary stat. Not a super huge nerf in the grand scheme of things, but it's actually a pretty large nerf when you consider that the gem itself was only giving you 120 primary stat to begin with. This cuts off, what, about 17% of the total value of the gem. It also helps that you can't use more than one of these at a time, so it's not like your entire set of gems just got gutted, but I think it's really interesting that the dev team has had to nerf the other type of new gem that was introduced in patch 8.2, because gems are causing sockets to get a little out of control. The nerf is also large enough that they couldn't really go any further. You can't really take a 120 stat gem any lower than 100 because the old primary stat gem, the Kraken's Eyes, they already stand at 80 primary stat. Going lower than 100 would be kind of silly because then the new gem wouldn't really provide any benefit over the old one, so what would be the point? Now, I think there's a few issues at play here, which has led to gems being too powerful in the current game, thus requiring the recent nerfs. As I said before, the other set of gems, the ones which provide secondary stats that were introduced in patch 8.2, were already nerfed. I'm pretty sure they didn't even make it into Season 3 at their full stat value. They started off at plus 60 secondary stats when patch 8.2 first launched, just like the new enchants that you can get for rings, but they were very quickly knocked down to just plus 50 secondary stats. The gems that we were using before that were already at plus 40 secondary stats, so going from 40 to 50 isn't really as exciting as going from 40 to 60, but these new epic gems were causing a whole bunch of problems when it comes to gearing up. With the new epic gems, a socket was suddenly worth significantly more than it was before, so much so that a lot of players were starting to value sockets at 10 or even 15 item levels, so a socketed 400 piece was actually better than a 415 piece of gear for a lot of classes, especially the ones which value their important secondary stats very highly. This is something that the dev team has said time and time again that they don't want to happen. They think you should be able to look at a piece of gear and recognize whether it's an upgrade or not at a glance. If it requires some external website and a few sims to decide between two pieces of gear, that's too complicated in the dev team's mind. But sockets are probably the most complicated part of gear to balance because different classes weigh their stats very differently. If all of your stats are more or less in line and your primary stat gives you the best bang for your buck, sockets aren't really worth too much after the first one or two. If haste is way better than agility or intellect, for example, sockets on gear start to become kind of crazy powerful. So much so that you see people running around with a full set of sockets that they just can't replace because they need to get super lucky to get a socket and a new piece of gear, and the way their stats work makes gems the most important factor in gearing up. So the gems were nerfed to limit the power of sockets. This nerf to the primary stat gem is simply the next step. This devalues a socket on your gear even more because it limits how much of any given stat you stand to gain from getting that super lucky RNG socket. But that kind of begs the question, if they didn't want sockets to become more powerful in the first place, why introduce any new gems at all? I think that's more of a problem with professions and how they have historically been pretty useless after the initial launch of an expansion. Legion was the first expansion where we saw new raw materials in a patch instead of the next expansion. That didn't work all too well because there weren't enough recipes to actually use the new materials, so they were kind of dead on arrival. In Battle for Azeroth, everyone got some new recipes. There's new herbs, new ores, new cloth, new potions, new flasks, new crafted gear, you name it. If it was craftable at the start of the expansion, a new version was introduced with patch 8.2. That's an effort to try and keep professions alive as an expansion progresses, and I think it worked kind of well. The problem is that dual crafting doesn't really have anything going for it these days. A lot of professions have been gutted. The only thing dual crafting really has left is gems, and that's kind of the most important resource they've always had, I guess, especially partway through an expansion where epic gems always come along. Epic gems have been a thing for a very long time, and they give each of your sockets an extra little boost, and they're usually introduced 1 or 2 patches into the expansion. But what's the problem here? Well, sockets don't work how they used to. Right now, sockets are completely random. You have a chance to get them on almost any type of gear, and with the exception of some crafted gear, the only way you can actually get a socket is to get lucky. It's kind of as simple as that. No luck means no sockets means no gems, which probably explains why gems are so cheap on the auction house, because no one has enough sockets to actually get through the chunk of gems that are available. Dual crafters will always be able to make more gems than we can use when we have no reliable source of sockets. But I guess that's more to do with dual crafting being a poor profession at the moment rather than why sockets are so powerful. Random sockets create a pretty frustrating scenario where you can get a piece of gear that can be mediocre or really amazing, completely dependent on your roll of the dice. That's the entire Warforging and Titan Forging system in a nutshell, but sockets are unique in that you get to choose how they affect your character. A Warforged item just gives you more of what's already there, but a socket can turn a lackluster item into a huge upgrade because you get to slap your best stat on an item that might not have it already. If you value haste higher than anything but you get an item with crit mastery on it, that can feel pretty crappy, especially if it's an item level upgrade but it's actually a DPS downgrade. Getting a Warforge or Titan Forge on that item can be a really weird mix of feelings because that increases the value of the item but it's still not really what you're looking for. A socket on the other hand says, yo, this item might not be ideal for you but check this out. You can add some haste in here even though you're not really supposed to. It feels way better than Warforging or Titan Forging, and it kind of reminds me of the old reforging system. You get to choose where your stats go and you can play around with variations and combinations to get your stats exactly where you want them to be. A few haste gems in here, maybe a few crit gems over there, and of course one of each primary stat gem. Being able to have some control over your character is a really nice touch in Battle for Azeroth because a lot of systems that allowed that in the past have been done away with. Sockets are really the only thing left, which makes it even worse that you can have no sockets or 12, fully dependent on how lucky you are. That's up to 600 of a secondary stat if you run with all sockets. That's absolutely insane. Now, I actually don't think this would have been that much of an issue if 8.2 hadn't have also brought in an interesting, but quite controversial new gearing up path. I've talked about benthic gear and its potential before, but I actually think benthic gear is the main reason why we're seeing the gems get nerfed. When your sockets are entirely random, it almost doesn't matter at that point how powerful the gems are. Obviously, it's still an issue for outliers where secondary stats are highly dominant, but for the most part, I really don't think Blizzard would care. Balancing hasn't been their strong suit lately, but benthic gear changes all of that. I don't dislike the benthic gear system. I think it's a fantastic catch-up mechanic and it works really well. It does its job fantastically. It also gives players who don't do any structured PvE content a way to work towards a higher item level, so all of that is fine. There are 2 major flaws with the benthic system though. These flaws hyper-inflate some benthic gear's power potential way past their max item level of 425. The first issue is the special effects. Some of them are quite powerful in terms of throughput. Simply equipping these items over an exact same item level piece with no special effects will yield fantastic results. Your DPS or HPS would increase quite noticeably, which is really exciting and fun to play around with. The problem is that the effects powers aren't reflected in the item level of the piece. For example, when we saw throughput increases from the gear in the Crucible of Storms, those items actually had less secondary stats to compensate for the power of the special effect. I think that kind of diminishes the special effect, but we can go back and forth on this all day. The effect was still considered in the item's overall stat budget. That isn't the case for benthic gear, and almost rightfully so. These effects only work in Nazjatar and the new raid 2, so it's not like this gear is also best in slot for Mythic Plus dungeons, older raids, or open world content outside of the Nazjatar zone. But that doesn't change the fact that 425 benthic gear is way more powerful than 425 normal gear simply because of the special effects. Now the second major problem is that benthic gear can roll sockets. It's still just a chance to roll a socket, but you can also create benthic gear endlessly. As long as you have the tokens or enough pearls to buy the tokens, you can create an infinite amount of benthic gear. There's no real way around that. You're eventually going to get a socket. It's literally unavoidable. Because benthic gear covers so many slots, you can almost get a full set of gear without sockets, without a great deal of effort. It's just a lot of time. When you start slapping these new epic gems into very easily obtainable sockets, your character's power starts inflating past your item level very quickly. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying something like non-raiders shouldn't have access to any sockets and blah blah. I'm saying that when you take something like sockets, which are inherently very powerful because you get to choose exactly how they affect your character's stats, and suddenly change them from this very rare occurrence that you have to get really lucky for to becoming very easily accessible on every piece of gear, you're going to run into some problems very quickly, especially when you introduce a new, more powerful gem. So that's why we're seeing these nerfs. Yes, the new gems make sockets a bit more powerful, but the real issue is that the gems make benthic gear specifically way too powerful. These days, I doubt anyone is upgrading their benthic gear unless they roll a socket on it, so a socket is almost guaranteed on a 425 benthic piece. With a guaranteed socket and a special effect that increases throughput, a 425 piece of benthic gear can be as powerful as some 450 item level pieces of gear. That might sound fantastic from a casual perspective, you can get some seriously powerful gear right now, but it's a pretty big problem for raiders in the Eternal Palace. They can't replace this stuff unless the mythic raid items drop with a socket, which, as we've already discussed, is a pretty rare occurrence. It's also really confusing for anyone who doesn't realize just how powerful benthic gear is. It says it's item level 425, so surely an item level 430 or 435 should be better than it, right? 9 out of 10 times right now, if you're replacing a piece of benthic gear which has a good special effect, good stats for you, and a socket, you're probably doing it wrong. It almost doesn't even matter what item level the upgrade is. If you replace that piece of benthic gear, your DPS will probably go down. That goes against what we mentioned before and what the dev team has told us they want to happen. An item level upgrade should be an upgrade for the most part. But honestly, most of this just comes down to random factors in gear. One of the reasons a lot of players are excited about Classic is because you always know what you're getting. If a specific sword drops, or a shield drops, or a helmet, no matter what piece of gear it is, you know exactly what it's going to do for your character and how much of an upgrade it will be if it drops. There's no lottery with the item level or the sockets on an item, it's just if the item drops or not. You don't need RNG on top of RNG on top of RNG. It's just gone too far at this point. Randomness in gear creates more frustration than it's worth, in my opinion, and I seriously hope it's one of the things that gets thrown in the trash when we move into the next expansion. I do have a sneaking suspicion that we will never see Warforging or Titan Forging removed from this version of the game, especially with Classic coming out. It's a case of if you want that kind of loot system, go play Classic, but I do hope sockets at least become more of a staple. Let's go back to the days where pieces of gear had a set number of sockets. Some gear had sockets, some gear didn't. There were even socket bonuses if you matched the correct colours. You had to decide whether that was worthwhile or not, which introduced a little bit of complexity into your decision making. Not a lot, but enough to make you stop and think. Do I really want that extra 5 intellect? Is it worth dropping 5 haste here or 5 crit here to pick up 5 mastery? I mean, I know the devs don't want gear to be too complex, but they should at least give us some some decisions to keep things interesting. In their quest to make everything straightforward and easy to understand, they've actually made gear and gearing up kind of boring and frustrating at best. I don't even make best in slot lists anymore because Warforges or Titan Forges of bad items can throw the whole thing off. You know, I don't want this item. This belt should not be an upgrade for me. It has crit mastery. I don't like crit mastery. I don't want this belt. But then it Titan Forges to 445 and I'm here like, well, I mean, I can't get better than that unless my other belt Titan Forges, or it just drops on a higher item level. It's just kind of weird. There's no point in planning anymore, I just wait and see what comes my way, which is definitely way less fun and way less interesting than going through and listing out all of my ideal items and getting really excited for a specific boss because I know certain things can drop. But that might just be me, your mileage may vary. But anyway, if you were wondering why we're seeing another gem nerf and why the other gems were nerfed previously, now you know. Benthic gear. What do you think of gearing in battle for Azeroth? If you could change just one thing about how gear works right now, what would it be? Leave all your thoughts in the comment section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You can see their names floating by on screen. If you want to join these lovely guys and gals, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave. If you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.